All right, so this morning we're going to look at Job 38 through chapter 40, verse 5. So this is God and Job, round one. There's going to be 2 rounds, so we'll finish up next time in the book of Job. So God and Job, round one. Again, Job and his friends have had these different cycles of speeches where Job would say something, a friend would respond. There was the 3 friends, and then the wisdom poem, and then Elihu had 3 or 4 speeches with Job. And remember, what has Job wanted the entire time? What has he wanted? He has wanted a word from God. He's wanted, I've been getting beat up by my friends for, hours, days, weeks, we don't know how long, but I need something from God. That's been his main complaint. So if we look at, there's going to be two speeches of God and Job. We'll look at one this morning. The one we'll look at is chapter 38 through chapter 40, verse 5. And then next time we'll get to chapter 40, verse 6, and that'll finish the book of Job with God's second speech with Job. So, after all the silence, all the divine silence, the Lord finally breaks that silence and speaks to Job. And maybe you can resonate or understand that position when you want God to speak in your life and you've been waiting for it. And so these speeches are directed specifically to Job. But it's interesting, the 2 speeches that God gives, as we're going to call them speeches, is not exactly what Job asked for. Job wanted to hear from God, but he wanted to hear a list of his crimes, a list of his sins, so that he could repent and have things made right in his life. But God does not bring a list of sins to Job like his friends did. God doesn't do that. Job is asked for a verdict from the divine judge, which is God, and he's not going to get that. So it's interesting. He hears from God, but it's not exactly what he wanted to hear. And the Lord answers Job, as we look at it this week and next time, with counter questions to Job. Not really positive statements or affirmations, but really counter questions to really try to put Job in his position as creature, not creator. So the speeches contain very little on God's, what we'd call his moral government of the universe in human actions, in your life or in my life. Very little on that. And if you look at it, there is no reference to Job's personal experience in God's speeches. There's no reference to Job's suffering in his speeches. That's interesting. I would not expect that. But that's what we find or what we don't find. As one writer says, quote, the initial effect of God's speeches to Job drives home to Job his ignorance. It is not intended to humiliate Job. On the contrary, the highest nobility of every person is to be enrolled by God himself in the school of wisdom. And the schoolroom is the world for God. So when God is asking these questions, he's not just trying to beat Job down. He is enrolling Job in the wisdom school to say, understand your place in the universe and respond accordingly in reverence to God. So let's jump in here. We're going to move quickly and then we'll stop so we can talk and have conversation and all that stuff. The first speech, God mentions 20 creatures and elements in the created order. And you can find all these in there. The earth, the sea, morning, light, snow, storm, rain, constellations, clouds, a lion, ravens, and ibex, a wild donkey, an ox, an ostrich, a horse, a hawk, all these different things. So it is emphasizing God's work in creation, that he sustains all things. There's no reference to Job's experience or his suffering. And the speech begins, if you look in chapter 38, when God answers Job out of the whirlwind, out of this tornado. That is interesting because when did Job's real suffering, personal suffering, begin? If you remember in chapter 1, it began when a great wind was stirred up and came in and destroyed his family, killed his entire family. That's when the real suffering began, out of the whirlwind. So God comes to him in the same fashion, in a whirlwind, in this kind of tornadic activity to speak to him. And God doesn't even reference Elihu. You're irrelevant. He goes right to Job. Elihu's the last one that talked to him. So God here is active in the storm. We could talk for 20 minutes on what that means in the Old Testament storm theophany. So think of like Moses at Sinai, God at Sinai. There's a storm at Sinai. God is present. And you can see that in the minor prophets like Zechariah and Nahum. You can see it in like Psalm 65, for example, that when there's a storm in the ancient Near Eastern mind, God is present. There's a God who's acting. So there's a whole lot there that we're going to just skim over for time this morning. But God is present here in the storm. God challenges Job first for speaking without knowledge. In your version, it probably says something like darkened counsel or something, which could mean one of two things. That Job has been subject to wisdom or instruction that is confusing, that is darkened, that has not enlightened his mind. That could be it. That's one way to refer to it. Or it could be a way of saying that God is bringing Job out of the dark into the light to see things in a clear perspective. So a couple ways to do that. He says, Job, dress for action, which is if you were going to do something difficult like build the temple or go to war with the Philistines, you would be told, dress for war, gird up your loins, gird up your little, they didn't wear pants, but your robe, your garment, and get ready to build the wall. If you're Nehemiah, get ready to build the temple. Get ready to go to war with the Moabites, Edomites. So God is saying, man up, Job. Here, let's have a conversation. Let's talk. So be prepared for it. That's a common Old Testament phrase. In verses 4 through 7, God asserts that the knowledge of the origins of the universe is beyond mankind's understanding because we were not present. We were not present. Darwin was not present. God is the one responsible for bringing all things out of nothing. Ex nihilo. That is a doctrine of the church from day one. That there was a time when there was just the triune God, and he spoke all things into existence. Think of Hebrews chapter 1. Think of John chapter 1. And God is saying, I was the one there doing all of this, bringing everything into existence. And he uses these analogies of builder, God does, of being a weaver, of putting together a garment, of a potter. Paul references that in Romans 9 through 11. So we learn in verse 7 that God was not alone when creation was finished. It talks about the sons of God shouted for joy and celebrated creation. The sons of God would be more than likely a reference to angels, messengers of God. Morning stars, probably a poetic way to describe angels. Verses 8 through 11, the origin of the sea is compared to childbirth. That's a lot of ancient Near Eastern symbolic language. So just one example, like the Babylonian god Marduk. In the creation account of the Babylonians, he destroyed the sea dragon, Marduk did, and created the sea and the land. And so there's a lot of kind of imagery from a very old ancient culture that he's drawing on, that God is using symbolically to help communicate truth to Job in his mindset. Again, this is why this is another reason why I think Job is a very early book, because this is some old ancient Babylonian Hittite language, Ugaritic language. With the Ugarites, it's Baal. He defeats the sea god Yam and creates all things, having domination over the sea and the water. So it's very, very old language. So that's another indication for me that this is old. This is an old book. I think pre-David, pre-monarchy. David 1,000 years before Christ, 900 years before Christ. Then in verses 12 through 15, God addresses the morning. In contrast with his description of the sea, here God describes the miracle that happens every morning. And the imagery here, that what God is saying is that night, darkness is like a garment that covers the earth. And it provides cover for the wicked to get away with their crimes. And dawn is the lifting of that garment of light so that everything is revealed. Everything is revealed, and it's a miracle. And if you read through the history of the church, there's all kinds of allegorical interpretations of how this represents God, the world, the church, Jesus, all that kind of stuff, when people were really stretching things to create Christologies and create stories of redemption. So in verses 16 through 18, God invites Job to give a report on his findings in the deepest parts of the earth and the sea. Give us a report. Let me know what you think, Job. Verses 19 through 21, light and darkness are personified. God says their reach is beyond Job's scope, but God says he is their guide who leads light. He leads darkness. In other words, God is actively involved in the creation of his world, and you would say in the providence, the maintenance, the government of his creation. He is not, as the Enlightenment thinkers theistic Enlightenment thinkers thought, he just creates it and then lets it go. Think of some of our founding fathers who were more deistic, Ben Franklin, others like that. God says, no, I'm involved in my creation. I have my hands in it, guiding things. 22 through 23 describes a storehouse of snow and hail. Again, this is just a very practical application, because I've seen several different folks who argue against Christianity because they look at the Old Testament and see it as anti-scientific. These are not scientific statements. These are poetic images, metaphors that God is using for a mind, Job's mind, which is at least, be conservative, 2,500 years ago, who doesn't know about Einstein or Newton or any of the scientists that we might refer to. God is using images, poetic images, that his person Job could understand. So it's not a scientific statement, but I've seen people argue against the Bible because of statements like this, and it's poetry. But you'd think that would be obvious. But
They would also have to argue against Lucretius, because On the Nature of Things, which is considered a work of science, is also a poem. It's poetry. So when you read the Bible, read the intent of the author. What is the author's intent? So when you read the book of Jonah, to pick one of the most controversial books in the Old Testament, what is the author's intent? It seems like it's a historical account. When you read Job at the beginning, there's names and people. What is the intent? Here, it's a poem. The intent of the poem is to convey poetry, images, symbols, so that you have a picture in your mind of what God is saying. But anyway, we'll keep going on here. Verses 24 through 27, rain and storms. And then he goes in verses 28 through 30, rain, dew, and ice. These are things in the ancient Near East that might have been seen as smaller gods, smaller deities that had a greater god or a greater deity. God says, no, these are things I control. I have complete control and guide these elements in creation. And then 31 through 33, he describes the heavens. And it's interesting, the sky, the sun, and the moon are not mentioned in these verses, because those often would be seen as deities as well. But he doesn't mention those. Let's see. Let's go on. The final verses here, verses 34 through 38. Job is reminded that he does not understand the movement of clouds or lightning. And again, this is symbolic language. Don't take it as scientific statements, because it's not what it is. And if think about it, if God had given Job scientific statements conservatively 2,500 years ago, probably more realistically at least 3,000 years ago, Job would have no structures of thought, no paradigm of thought, no context to understand anything. It would have been even more frustrating, because Job doesn't have that information. So if that helps at all. And it ends in verse 38 with a survey of the natural phenomenon. So the remainder of the first speech is devoted to living creatures that are closer to man's inspection as he goes on and to finish up chapter 38. So he talks about a lion, and helpless young ravens are mentioned. And God is saying, these are things that you've seen. Job, have you provided for these things that you've seen? As it goes into chapter 39, the first animal mentioned is a wild goat or an ibex, an animal that still is present around the wilderness and the Dead Sea. And God says, Job, without your help, believe it or not, I've been able to preserve these animals. They survive without your help, Job. I don't know if you knew that. And the cliffs in which many of the goats would inhabit are not accessible to Job. Job he doesn't have the gear for accessing that area. God says, but I can take care of them. Next, in verses 5 through 8, is the wild donkey. This animal has its own life, exists for God's purpose, his purposes, and not for mankind. God says, this animal is for me, for my glory. It lives independent. That's how it's portrayed, as an independent animal here. Let's run through these animals quickly, and then we'll have some conversation. Then he moves on to in verses 9 through 12, the buffalo or the wild ox. It's a large animal. From what I've read, it's been extinct since about 1627, so 17th century, but it was known to roam in this area. And hunting this large beast, again, this is pre-gunpowder,
rifle. So you're getting more engaged, more close to the animal. This was a sport of kings and royalty to show their bravery and to show what they could do so that their subjects would pay taxes and join the military. So you have the Assyrian emperor bragging about it in some of his writings, many Assyrian emperors that bragged about it. And they would have different artistic portrayals of how brave they were with a blade or with a bow to kill this wild animal. So it's respected for its power if you could hunt it down. Very large animal, one of the largest in the region outside of the elephant. Next we have, let's see, God goes in verses 13 to 28, he leaves this huge animal that you would hunt for sport, and there's a contrast here. He goes to a lighthearted description of the ostrich. And the only thing you really need to know here is there's two things that God is trying to get across to his mind in the ancient Near East. That the positive of the ostrich is it's very fast, so its defense is running away. That's the positive. The negative in that mindset, in that culture, is the ostrich is about as dumb as it gets as an animal. So very fast, can flee from a lion, from something, can really try to evade, capture. That's its strength, but is known for being stupid. So 2nd century BC Egyptian story describes this. It talks about an ostrich who laid her eggs in the sand and goes away and forgot all about it. Did not take care of her young because the ostrich is stupid. So that's kind of the mindset. So you wanted to be faster than an ostrich, that was a proverbial saying, but you also didn't want to be stupid like the ostrich. So those are the things that God is bringing out about this animal. And God says, I have the freedom to create an animal for my glory who is fast and can run and is a unique animal, but also an animal that's stupid. I can do that. I have the freedom to do that as creator. Job, I don't need your opinion on the ostrich. I didn't ask you when I created it. And then verses 19 through 25, a description of the horse, which again, a powerful animal, an animal very necessary, depending on when this was written, necessary at some point in the history of the ancient Near East for military action. So you remember the Israelites, they wanted chariots with horses like they saw in Egypt, and God says, you don't need to trust in, you remember the psalmist, don't trust in chariots, don't trust in horses, trust in God. And part of that was because you don't really need, we talked about this a few years ago when we preached on King David and Absalom, when Absalom is racing around Jerusalem with his chariots. You didn't need chariots in Jerusalem because of the terrain. You could not use them. You might use them in Egypt, and you would use them in Egypt. But in Jerusalem, chariots are kind of worthless because you're up on an elevated area. It doesn't work for the terrain. But Absalom was showing his power, who he was. He was going to take over. He was trying to show everyone who he was. So here, God says, he describes the horse ready for action. And God says two things to Job. Can you make an animal like this? The answer is no. And can you control an animal like this? Really, probably not. Probably not. Then he goes on to the hawk in verse 26, a migrating hawk going south. And God says, who provided the instinct for this hawk to survive and to migrate south? Job, did you contribute to that? I don't think you did. And then the final question given to Job in his first speech is about the eagle, or it may be translated vulture in your text, depending on what you're using. It's the same word in Hebrew, so could be eagle, could be vulture. It's the same. The Hebrew is neser, N-E-S-E-R, as you translate it. And so he says, Job, is it by your command that the eagle or the vulture flies so high? I would take it as eagle. That makes the most sense rather than vulture. Is it at your command that the eagle flies so high? No, it's not. The ability is given from the Creator to the eagle.
I've seen eagles out in the road eating roadkill like buzzards.
Okay,
and
yeah.
I think in years gone by, they were kind of equated with buzzards.
Yeah.
And that's why Ben Franklin wanted the turkey to be our national bird.
Okay, yeah.
Than the eagle.
Yeah, I don't have that in my notes, but that is true. So it could be eagle, could be vulture. And then I'll finish with this.
Sorry.
No, you're good. You're good. That's why we have discussion, by the way. After the first speech, the question is presented to Job. He says,
Shall a fault finder contend with the Almighty? That's what he asked him. He who argues with God, let him answer. So it's a question of humility. So Gregory the Great, who is many years ago, patristic church, he said, "Blessed Job, therefore, is not blamed for having done anything perversely, but he is informed by God, so that Job may humbly submit himself to him who is specially the highest." That was Gregory the Great. So Job responds, last thing, verses 3 through 5. This is the end of God's first encounter with Job. Job is invited to speak, and he responds in verses 3 through 5 of chapter 40. His response is very restrained. It is very subdued. It is very humble. It's a modest response. And so the question might be, if you're really pressing the text, why does God need another speech? Why does God need another speech? And I think I'm stealing, this isn't my answer, I'm stealing this from a guy from, I think he's from, I don't know where he's from, I think Yale, but maybe not. He says, quote, "Job's reply here is somewhat evasive and not at all satisfactory to the matter. The gesture of Job placing the hand over his mouth could be a mark of respect or just a sign of his silence. Job admits that he cannot answer, but he still does not admit to any sin. So there is no confession from Job, nor does he retract any of his former statements. So there is no submission from Job to God. On the contrary, Job seems to be sticking to his guns maybe a little bit." I had that little bit. That's not in the text. He's sticking to his guns. I would say maybe just a little bit. Job has already spoken once and need say no more. Job has nothing to say that he has not already said. So this is just perspective. You can have different views on this. Perhaps the reason there's a second speech is because Job has been silenced, but he's not fully convinced. Job is still, okay, God, I hear you, and has put his hand over his mouth, but he still needs one more lesson because he's not fully submitted to God. He's not fully confessed anything. A couple final just summary thoughts, and then we'll talk for a few minutes. Job expected a word from God, but was it the word he expected? It was not. And you think about that in a redemptive historical context. What did the people of Israel in the first century AD expect from God when God arrived? They expected a king. They expected someone to march into Jerusalem. They expected a different type of word from God. And they didn't get that one. They got one who made tables and benches and chairs for at least a decade or two. And then went on a ministry where he was a homeless teacher, healer, wonder worker, and was then abandoned by all of his friends, tortured, crucified. That's not the word of God that they expected. So you see that a little bit of a pattern here. Job gets a word from God, but it's not what he expected. What we expect sometimes from God, even in our own lives, apart from the coming of Christ, the objective work of God, is often not what we expect. But it is always what you need. Always what I need. So again, you see a pattern there. You think, oh God, this is what I need. God knows a little bit more about what I need and what you need. And so here you see a little bit of an element of God's sovereignty, his wisdom. Think of Galatians 4. When the fullness of time came, God sent forth his son, born of a woman, under the law to redeem those under the law. So we might receive adoption as sons. That's not what people were expecting, but that's what God did. A second point to think about, when confronted with the greatness of God, Job is humbled. Here, this will not be a sermon, I promise. This will be 1 minute. Most of our worship experience in the Christian church in the West today does not lead us to humility. And I don't want to pick on any church in particular, but as you see in Isaiah 6, when Isaiah is confronted with God and he is silenced. And you see in Revelation 1, when John has a vision on the Lord's day, he is led to silence. Most of our worship in the church today, our worship experience, as it's called wrongly, does not lead us to silence because we have a very small God. And I'm specifically talking about Western Christianity. It leads to again, I'm not going to preach. It leads to entertainment. It leads to our being very vocal, and maybe we'll run around and go crazy, whatever it might be. We feel really good about ourselves. It doesn't lead us to silence and humility, which means our God is not very big. John Calvin, a guy you've probably heard of before, says in the Institute's Book 1, Section 1, Subsection 3, The story of Job, in its description of God's wisdom, power, and purity, always expresses a powerful argument that overwhelms individuals with the realization of their own stupidity, impotence, and corruption. So that's kind of Calvin can get a negative name for some of his comments, and that could be seen as that, but he's basically saying the same thing that Job is experiencing. We realize that we're not that bright, stupidity. We're not that powerful, impotence. We are not that good. We are, as Calvin says, corrupt. And that's a good thing. We'll talk about that at 10:30. That's the law of God saying you need redemption. And that's our story in Luke 10. What do I need to do to earn eternal life? Well, you can't. That is the law. So last point here, God's long silence with Job is followed by his word. You see that pattern in the Old and New Testament. Malachi is the last prophet of the Hebrew Bible, what we call the Old Testament. There's 400 years of silence where the people are like, did God forget about us? What's going to happen? Because the Romans are here and they're in charge. It didn't work out too well. But God finally speaks. Hebrews 1, long ago, many times, in many ways, God spoke to our fathers by the prophets, but in these last days, he's spoken by his son. It was 4 centuries of absolute silence from Malachi to John the Baptist coming and saying, look at this guy behind me. And then in these speeches, as you see, God is sovereign over all creation. That description of God is applied to Jesus Christ in the New Testament. Think of Colossians 1. By him all things were created, Christ, in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, thrones, dominions, rulers, authorities. All things were created through him and for him, Jesus Christ. And he is before all things. In him all things hold together. So what you see in Job about God the Father, his description is applied to Christ. And you can think of Luke 8. A few months ago we were in Luke 8. We're going gradually through Luke. A herd of pigs. Christ has dominion over the herd of pigs. We saw in Luke 8, we saw he has dominion over the water when there's a storm. And the veteran fishermen who've been on the water every day for years are terrified. Christ has dominion over that. So the description here in Job is applied to Christ as well. Let me stop there.